Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades, and my name is Albert.
And I'm Joan. Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, hope everyone's having a reasonable day and staying safe from the global pandemic and all that. So this is going to be the first in what we call our series, part of one of our series of themed episodes. Um, So what's going to happen is that I'm I have planned out a series focusing on a subject that I am particularly interested in. In this case, the evolution of modern birds, and there we will do a series of episodes about this subject um, every 2 to 3 weeks or so until we finish the series, and then in our next episode, Joan will start a series that she has planned about a human evolution, and we will alternate between these subjects for as long as it takes to cover all the episodes that we have planned.
Right, it's
Uh,
everything and anything you'd ever want to know about our topics. We'll cover them for you.
right, exactly. Um, so that's the plan at least, and of course, just as a reminder, if you I guess forgot about or didn't listen to our first episode, the first episode or the first show, I guess calling them episodes is a little misleading. Our first show that we record on every month is going to be covering natural history related news. But all of our other episodes are going to be alternating between these two series of uh, themed episodes, I guess, themed shows. So yeah, um, right. So as I mentioned, the series that I have chosen is going to be about modern birds. This is essentially the subject of my research, or at least the kind of broad topic that encompasses my research: the origins and evolution of modern birds or crown birds through deep time. Um, And the reason I wanted to do this was because, well, for one thing, I'm really interested in dinosaurs, like all dinosaurs, um, and the thing about popular media about dinosaurs, educational media about dinosaurs, like books or documentaries, is that a very common way that they end, and you probably have had this experience as well, Joan, is that they'll end talking about the end Cretaceous mass extinction and how all of the dinosaurs died except for birds. But isn't it great that we still have these over 10,000 species of dinosaurs still alive today? And then they kind of just end it there. But the thing is, I can understand why they do that because, well, first of all, there are a lot of Cenozoic birds, and there, as mentioned, as they will often mention, there are over 10,000 species of Cenozoic birds. So obviously, going into the same amount of detail about all the Cenozoic birds is not practical if you're writing a book focused on Mesozoic dinosaurs. And of course, most people who pick up books about Mesozoic dinosaurs or dinosaurs in general are mostly interested in their Mesozoic diversity and their Mesozoic history. So I understand why you know popular media often just glosses over the kind of last 66 million years of dinosaur slash bird evolution because it is not what they are trying to focus on. But nonetheless, as someone who is interested in all dinosaurs, and not just the Mesozoic ones, although Mesozoic dinosaurs are absolutely awesome. Obviously, I my avatar here is a Mesozoic dinosaur, so don't go thinking that I don't like them. But it is not the complete story of dinosaurs if you don't consider the Cenozoic history of birds. And there have been 66 million years between the Cretaceous mass extinction and today. Um, so, in fact, there has been quite a lot of other evolutionary events that birds have gone through within that time, and so that's why I decided to call this this series, Dinosaurs, the second chapter. So it's the second chapter that you don't usually get to read about in popular media. So is that a common experience that you've had as well?
Oh yeah, certainly in later years. I remember I'm old enough to remember some of the more vintage books that I owned.
Oh,
They just
absolutely.
simply ended it with, "Oh, and then some a day came when all the dinosaurs mysteriously disappeared, and nobody knows why. And here are these small little mammals in the background, and they'll inherit the earth and give rise to humanity." And yeah, usually birds were never really mentioned unless it was Archaeopteryx.
Yeah, of
Of
course.
course, nowadays we have the benefit of knowing that Archaeopteryx shares a common ancestor with birds, and they have something to do with dinosaur history because they are dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
I've kind of had a little bit of both as
yeah,
I've grown up.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you go even older books to when we were children, because we're about the same age, um, that definitely you will find books that don't really mention birds at all and just go into, oh, all the dinosaurs died, we don't know why, and so on. But of course, in more recent works, there's definitely a recurring pattern of, oh yeah, we have birds now, but that's kind of all we're gonna talk about when it comes to Cenozoic birds. Um, yeah, I think one of the maybe it was. I mean, it almost certainly wasn't the earliest, but one of the earliest in my memory would have been Walking with Dinosaurs, actually. Um, at the very end of the last episode, where they do this sort of ending where the Cretaceous mass extinction happens, but they mention that birds are living dinosaurs, and so we still do have the legacy of dinosaurs living alongside us today.
Oh yeah, that was brilliantly done too. That was one of my earliest memories as well.
Mm,
I remember I'd watch the VHSs with my cousins, and
yeah.
we'd get to that part, and they set it up so well too, because like they show all this footage of these majestic African megafauna,
Mm,
and then they're like, oh, one small group of dinosaurs did survive the extinction. So you're immediately thinking like, oh, they're gonna talk about like some far off jungle somewhere where there's like a lone dinosaur, and then they're like, surprise, it's the birds, and they show all the birds, and it's like this huge flock of geese or
right.
ducks or whatever just flying in the air, and it's just that leaves an impression on you for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I
In fact, I
mean,
remember uh, growing up, like literature wise, I didn't get a lot of that.
mm,
Certainly, children nowadays have the extreme benefit of that information.
right.
I remember I was at a store at one point, and I saw the new version of the Golden Book of Dinosaurs as part of that classic children's literature series, where they've updated all the information and new images and stuff.
Mm,
And because it's funny, like I grew up with the old edition by Peter Zallinger,
mm,
which was completely different. And
right.
now this new edition for the children of today, it ends as you said, like with mentioning modern birds, and in fact, it's a little girl at a fountain with all these pigeons flying around her,
Oh,
like New
right.
York City pigeons, and yeah, it mentions like, oh, the dinosaurs never really died out; they're still
Right.
around. They're plentiful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've seen people post pictures of that. That is really nice. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, it's a great way to end books like that or TV series like that. But definitely, there isn't a whole lot of information about what happened in between Len and today. So how did we get these 10,000 species of modern birds after the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction? They didn't all just appear at once, although they did probably go through a pretty explosive radiation shortly after, as we will see. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what my series is about. It'll be about that time frame of bird evolution, and basically we're gonna go through all of the major groups of living birds and talk about their features and what we know about how they came to be the way they are. So I'm pretty excited to get started. How about you?
I'm definitely excited for sure. I mean, I can tell my avatar is a modern bird.
Right.
I'm totally with you in that excitement.
Excellent. So the group of birds we're going to be focusing on in this series are the crown birds or modern type birds, and this requires a bit of an explanation of scary terminology, but I think it's relatively straightforward once you get to know it. So I have a slide here trying to explain what a crown group is. So, um, well, what do we mean by crown bird? Now, a crown group is a term that can be applied to pretty much any living group of organisms. So, a crown group is the last common ancestor of all living members of a group and all of its descendants. And living is kind of a key word there. So, we're talking about uh, the last common ancestor of all modern birds and anything descended from that common ancestor. Now, this is a phylogenetic tree. So if you are listening to this series, I'm kind of assuming you know how to read a phylogenetic tree, but I will go through the basics here just in case. Um, so a phylogenetic tree is basically a representation of how different organisms are related to one another. And so it is not showing the organisms on the tips of the branches evolving into one another. What it does is that it shows their common ancestry. So over here on the rightmost part of the tree, I put a pigeon, and next to it is a terror bird. And now this is a phylogenetic tree doesn't have to be plotted out against time, although I did for the purposes of explaining these concepts. So you can see that the terror bird is a bit lower down than the pigeon, but that's just to show that the terror bird is found further back in time. And now what it's showing is that where the two branches join together, where the two branches of leading to the terror bird and the pigeon join together, represents their last common ancestor. And then you go a bit more to the left, and there's an ostrich there, and then it joins the branch leading to both the terror bird and the pigeon a little bit farther back in time. So they share a more distant common ancestor. And so from this, what this tree is showing is that a terror bird is more closely related to a pigeon than to an ostrich. And then if you go a little bit further out, you'll see that all of these groups are a little bit more distantly related to a velociraptor, and all of these groups are a little bit more distantly related to a sauropod dinosaur. And then over here on the leftmost side is a crocodilian, specifically a crocodile. Now, the closest living relatives of birds are crocodilians. They both belong to a group called the archosaurs. And so, um, basically, a crown bird uh, is the group that includes all living birds, their last common ancestor, which in this diagram would be the last common ancestor of the ostrich and the pigeon, uh, and all of its descendants. So the terror bird is a descendant of the last common ancestor of the ostrich and the pigeon. So it is a crown bird, even though it is extinct. And now, there are a range of taxa, as we just briefly discussed, that are extinct, but are more closely related to birds than to crocodilians. So even though crocodilians are the closest living relatives of birds, we do know that birds have plenty of closer relatives in the fossil record, and so these would have included all of the non-bird dinosaurs, for example. And so all of these groups that are not crown birds, but are more closely related to birds than to anything else alive today, are called stem birds. And this terminology can be applied to pretty much any group of living things that you can think about. So modern organisms that you can think about. So for example, I guess we could use one of Joan's favorite subjects, human evolution. So the last common ancestor of all living humans and all of its descendants would be crown humans. Now, there's only one species of living human alive today, isn't that right?
That's right.
Yep.
Almost equal.
So there's only one species of crown human that is alive today. But if you go into the fossil record, uh, well, actually, before we go there, well, what are the closest living relatives to humans?
That would be the chimpanzee and the bonobo,
Right,
but I like to combine them as chimps. That's the
right.
genus Pan.
Yeah. So in the fossil record, we do know that there are a range of fossil species that are more closely related to us than to chimps. And so all of these fossil species um, that are not members of crown humans but are more closely related to us than to anything else alive today would be stem humans. And so that would include, everything from uh, Australopithecus to Homo erectus to Neanderthals. Um, all of those would be stem humans. And so I know that some people struggle a lot with these concepts. I've even seen a lot of proper scientific papers use these concepts incorrectly. And I've heard working paleontologists say, why do we have this crown and stem uh, terminology? It seems so confusing, and I don't see why it's useful. I think, at least my perspective on it, is that I think it's useful because um, it's an easy way to explain what the relationships are between a certain fossil organism and living species that we might be more familiar with. Um, so we can say that, if we now it might not be as useful if you only work on a group that is completely extinct, that has if you don't consider that group's relationships to living organisms. But I think if we are working on groups that have both living and extinct members, it becomes quite useful to talk about. So, for example, we can go back to terror birds because I have one on the slide here. The closest living relatives of terror birds are a South American group of birds called the Seriemas, and they basically look like mini terror birds, kind of. So we can say that terror birds are stem Seriemas because they are not, part of the modern group of Seriemas, but they are more closely related to Seriemas than to any other living animal. Uh, so if you say that terror birds are stem Seriemas, that's a very shorthand way of saying they are their closest living relatives are the Seriemas. And then you can also say that terror birds are crown birds. They are part of this group of that includes all living birds, but not the species that are a bit more distantly related. And if you say that, what you can do is that you can infer that you can expect that terror birds, even though they are extinct and we don't know, we don't have much direct evidence of their soft tissues or their behavior, you can expect that terror birds would have had all of the characteristics that are shared by all living birds because they are members of this crown bird group. Whereas if an animal is a stem bird, it might share some characteristics with living birds, but it's also going to be different in some other ways, or at least we would expect them to be different in some other ways. And so I think this stem and crown terminology is a good way of quickly expressing relationships between groups, and also when kind of it's helpful for discussing what kind of features we would expect to see in different groups of organisms. What do you think?
I think it's certainly very helpful. There is like I do have a bit of a loaded question,
Mm-hmm.
and you might know where I'm going with this.
Sure.
Since we're dealing with crown and stem, and we're sort of using a very common vernacular for these terms,
Mm.
are stem birds birds?
Right. Yeah. 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 Well, what is a bird really? So the terms crown birds and stem birds. Okay, or rather, the stem and crown terminology doesn't really imply necessarily that we should consider all stem birds, or we should consider all stem birds to be birds. What it's saying is simply that these organisms are more closely related to birds than to any other living group. But whether or not you want to consider them birds is kind of a subjective thing. Like I suspect most people probably wouldn't consider a sauropod to be a bird. Now they do share some features with birds, and they are more closely related to birds than to any other living group. But obviously, a sauropod just in our minds looks very 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 different from our concept of a bird. So I suspect most people wouldn't consider a sauropod a bird, even though they are stem birds. So I guess the question of what does it take to to be a bird is a kind of a subjective question, and that it's kind of up to you individually to decide where you want to draw the line along the stem, what is a bird or not. And I know some people who would answer that only crowned birds are birds, and nothing outside of the crown should be considered a bird, even if they are very bird-like. So there are varying degrees of how we use a word bird, which is obviously, as you say, a vernacular term, um, not a strictly scientific one. Does that help?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I guess it certainly would be subjective too in a what if situation.
Right.
Like if an animal related to velociraptors somehow survived to the present
Mm,
day and all throughout the history of classification was considered a bird, well then the definition of crowned bird would shift to include all the members of that
that's right.
group.
Yes, yes, yeah. So yeah. These terms are also kind of independent of the names of the technical names of these groups that we hang on, as we will see. So the group that corresponds to crowned birds as we currently understand them is also called Neornithes or aves. Um, Now, aves is kind of the traditional name for the bird group, and there are people who prefer to apply this name to the crown group, so they will say that aves equals crowned birds, and I do like this suggestion, but the problem is that some paleontologists use the term aves for a different group that includes part of the stem. So they include things like Archaeopteryx and Confuciusornis and Ichthyornis, which are not crowned birds that are pretty close relatives of crowned birds. As members, they call this group aves. So I think it's usually less confusing to use Neornithes, even though aves was named first. Um, but nonetheless, basically throughout the series, if I say crown birds, if I say Neornithes, if I say probably if I say aves, and if I say modern type bird, I'll try to avoid using modern bird because that's a little confusing because obviously there are members of crown birds that have not survived to modern day. But if I say modern type bird, the birds that have all the characteristics we would expect of modern birds, then those all mean the same thing. Those all mean the crowned bird group.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a lot of historical baggage with a lot
right.
of taxonomic names for modern groups. I mean, I know
Right.
this is a similar problem with reptiles,
Mm-hmm.
with mammals, with
Mm-hmm.
amphibians,
Yep.
fish on certain technicalities.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. So all of these names have their own kind of internal taxonomic arguments about which group to apply them to and all of that. Um, So yeah, that is a general overview of what we mean by crown and stem birds. And if you haven't been scared away by that yet, hopefully you'll enjoy the series. Just as an additional note is that the crown and the stem together, so the entire branch that includes modern birds, but not their closest living relatives, the crocodilians, um, would be called the total group birds or the pan birds. Um, so that's another piece of, I guess, useful terminology in this context. So if we want to refer to the entire branch, we can call all of them pan birds. And of course, there were also stem crocodilians and many, and they were very diverse. But of course, since this series is not focused on crocodilians, I did not show the stem crocodilians on this diagram. Um, but nonetheless, you can take any basically living group and find the crown for that group and the stem for that group and the total group for that group. Yeah, so it's a very kind of universally applicable terminology as long as you apply it consistently, which unfortunately you know some some studies haven't done. But nonetheless, this is the original and intended definition of this terminology, so that's what I'm going to use, and hopefully uh, we can all stick with it. All right, so let's go to the next slide, where I talk about some of the features that characterize crown birds or neornithes. Now, if you only look at living animals, if you only look at modern animals, it's super easy to identify a bird, right? Would you
Oh
agree?
yeah, they're the only ones with feathers.
Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Like, maybe you might mistake a bat for a bird if you don't get a very good look at it. There are certain kinds of moths that people often mistake for hummingbirds, because a hummingbird is basically a dinosaur trying to be a moth. But other than that, you're not very likely to confuse a bird for anything else. We have a very clear search image of what a bird looks like and what kind of features we would expect to see in birds. But as we shall see, if you look back in the fossil record and look at stem birds, you'll see that distinguishing modern birds from their closest relatives can actually be quite difficult. And in fact, to a degree, we're still not entirely sure what the features are, what features characterize Neornithes compared to the groups that are most related to them. Because the fossil record of the kind of origins at the very base, very close to the base of crown birds, is actually relatively poor. We don't actually know that much about it, and so that's a problem we're still working on. In fact, my lab mate Juan is studying a bird. A stem bird called Ichthyornis, which was very closely related to modern birds, and it's one of the best known stem birds from that part of the a total bird family tree. See, I'm using that terminology right now. The total bird family tree, and so it's likely to give us a better idea of, what are the features that distinguish crown birds from all their close relatives in the fossil record. But a few features that have been identified that are currently considered to characterize crown birds are some of the ones that I have listed here. Um, Though, first of all, as you probably know, modern birds are entirely toothless, whereas most other dinosaurs and most other stem birds um, have teeth. Now, there are the toothlessness has evolved a number of times within stem birds, but nonetheless, modern birds can be uh, distinguished from the closest known relatives that we have good skull material of, like Ichthyornis, by not having any teeth at all. So modern birds are entirely toothless, which makes them different from some of their closest known relatives in the fossil record. Modern birds also have a lot of hip vertebrae. They have 11 or more hip vertebrae, which is a large number. I think dinosaurs ancestrally have something like two or three. This actually evolved several times at the base of Dinosauria. This kind of increase in hip vertebrae, or rather the trend to increase hip vertebrae from what is ancestral of tetrapods in general. So the ancestral tetrapods. I'm saying this off the top of my head. I'm not checking any sources. So if I get things wrong, then please let me know. But ancestrally, I believe tetrapods have only one hip vertebra. So the vertebra that attaches to the pelvis, which slowly increases when we get into dinosaurs and also into some other groups like mammals too. Um, so dinosaurs ancestrally have two or three hip vertebrae, I think, and then this gradually increases over time as you get closer to birds. And now in modern birds, there are 11 or more hip vertebrae that are in fact fused to their pelvic girdle. So they have a lot of hip vertebrae, which kind of makes their hindquarters pretty stiff. Birds have very stiff bodies in general. Which probably is helpful when they're flying, because that means the rest of their bodies are kind of flopping around while they're trying to stay in flight. Less of a drag that way. And also, modern birds seem to be distinguished from their close fossil relatives by having these grooves or crests near the base of their ankle joint. So what I have posted a picture here to kind of show you what these look like. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at the base of what we call the tarsometatarsus bone. And this is a bone in birds where the ankle bone, or some of the ankle bones, are fused with the bones of the foot. So the long bones of the foot are called the metatarsals, and these bones are fused in birds. And so we're looking at the underside, so kind of the equivalent of your heel. So you look at the underside of your heel, you're looking at the equivalent kind of location here in birds. And in birds, they have a little structure poking out of the underside of their heel called the hypotarsus. And along the hypotarsus, there are these grooves or canals in modern birds where the tendons pass through. So these are tendons for moving the toes, for example. And in modern birds, there are these crests and grooves. Sometimes they're pretty shallow. There might be several of them or just one. But nonetheless, we don't seem to see this in close fossil relatives of birds, where there's just a hypotarsus with a kind of a smooth underside. So that's the character that's being discussed here. Um, and I guess just for the record, uh, birds stand on their toes, so this part of the foot is actually held off the ground when they're standing. And so some people kind of make the very understandable mistake of thinking that birds have backwards knees. But in fact, the backward pointing joint you see there is in fact the ankle, and the knee in a bird is held close to the body. But because the feathers are usually covering that area, you usually can't see the actual knee in a living bird in the flesh very well. So what you're usually seeing, the kind of the big joint that you see exposed on the leg, is actually the ankle joint.
So birds are walking on their tippy toes.
Right, pretty much. Yeah. No. Uh, yeah. Do you have anything else to add?
Nope.
Okay. So on the next slide, I have a very, very brief introduction to the origin of the features we see in birds, features we associate with birds. So this series is going to focus on the evolution of birds uh, after they were already, modern type birds. So we're going to focus on the evolution within crowned birds. But nonetheless, I think it would be pretty useful to have a brief review of the origin of what we consider birdie features, along the avian stem as well. There are a lot of great resources for about the subject, so I'm going to try not to go into too much detail. But even so, I think it's a very interesting subject that I enjoy thinking about a lot and reading about. So I think it would be useful to have this review here. So I guess if you want to learn more about the subject, a couple of good references I recommend. Um, One would be the online lecture notes for his dinosaur course series by Dr. Thomas Holtz, who was one of my instructors when I was an undergrad geology major at the University of Maryland. He teaches a course for undergraduates um, about basically the evolution and biology of Mesozoic dinosaurs, and he definitely goes into the subject of the sequential acquisition of bird-like characteristics among dinosaurs. So he has these publicly available online lecture notes on his website that we will link in the description, which are very useful if you want to learn more about that subject. If you want a crash course in dinosaur paleontology, that's one of the best places to go. The another useful reference would be the recent book "Dinosaurs: How They Lived and Evolved" by Dr. Darren Naish and Dr. Paul Barrett, who are both British paleontologists. It is probably the most up to date and comprehensive kind of intro book to dinosaur paleontology, and they actually even go into a little bit. About a Cenozoic bird history in that book. So when I say it's pretty comprehensive, it really is. What do you think, Joan?
I believe Steve Brusati's recent book, The Rise and Fall of the
Hmm.
Dinosaurs, devotes a chapter or two
Hmm.
to bird evolution. So I
Right.
think that would be a good resource if you're looking for something even more introductory than those two
Hmm.
resources.
Okay, yeah, that's a good recommendation. I'm sorry to say I still haven't read that book properly, but yes, I believe that is true. It does have a few chapters about bird origins and how birds evolved from other dinosaurs. So yes, good one. Yep. So without further ado, let's unpack this diagram that I have up here. So of course, as we have mentioned about a million times already, and as you probably know from popular dinosaur references, birds are a kind of dinosaur, and so they actually do retain certain features from the last common ancestor of all dinosaurs. So one of the features that characterizes dinosaurs is what we call an open hip socket, and what this means is that in most vertebrates that have a hip socket, the the inside of the hip socket is just solid bone, so it's just a cup-like structure of solid bone, and then the thigh bone fits into that, and it's pretty straightforward. But if you pick up the hip girdle of a dinosaur, and you look through it, you can see that there's a hole going through the hip socket. So you can see through one side of the hip socket to the other side because there's a hole running right through it. And in life, this hole would have been walled off by a bit of cartilage, but it is not bone. So after an animal dies, and the cartilage decays, and then the bony part left behind it has an open hole in it. So we call this an open hip socket, and that's a characteristic of dinosaurs. And if you ever have the chance to look at a bird pelvis, you can see that they still have this open hip socket. Also, birds walk on two legs. There aren't that many animals today that walk on two legs. Obviously, we are one of those that do, but other than us, there aren't that many. So birds, there are various hopping animals that could walk around on or hop around on two legs. Obviously kangaroos come to mind, although when kangaroos are moving slowly, they actually walk on five limbs, I guess you could say. They walk on their five. Sorry, they walk on their 4 feet, but they also support themselves with their tail and kind of shuffle along in a very interesting gait. They don't only use bipedal locomotion. There are various hopping rodents that can also hop around on two legs. Pangolins will sometimes walk on two legs. You can find a lot of videos of one species called the ground pangolin that spends a lot of time walking on two legs. Although, contrary to what seems to be an increasingly popular belief, pangolins do also walk on 4 legs, so they're not entirely two-legged walkers. And of course, there are a few other animals um, that sometimes walk on 2 legs, even if they don't habitually do so most of the time. So I think some bears can walk a few steps on 2 legs. There, of course, other primates can often walk for some distance on 2 legs as well, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I know gibbons primarily use a two-legged walking when they're on the ground, of course, which isn't often because they prefer to be up in the trees. But when they come to the ground, they often walk on 2 legs. But other than that, there aren't that many animals today that walk on 2 legs. But ancestrally, dinosaurs were two-legged animals. So even though later on many of them evolved back to walk on 4 legs, things like sauropods, giant long-necked plant eaters, many of the plant-eating groups, like the horned dinosaurs and the armored dinosaurs, they eventually evolved the ability to go back on all fours and walk around on 4 legs. But the last common ancestor of dinosaurs, as far as we can tell, was a two-legged animal, and the ancestors of birds never changed that, so they continued to walk on 2 legs. A possible feature that originated at the base of dinosaurs, or potentially even before that, are feathers. So there's a lot of controversy about when feathers evolved in the bird line, in total group birds, because we do know that a lot of the groups that were closely related to modern birds definitely had feathers. But we have found also feather-like structures in groups of dinosaurs that were not that closely related to birds. So there is a possibility that feathers were already present in the last common ancestor of all dinosaurs. In fact, I think that is quite plausible since this animal would have been a quite small animal. Yeah, we usually think of dinosaurs as gigantic, animals, but the ancestral dinosaur would have been a relatively small creature, definitely smaller than a person, and maybe around the size of a cat even. So potentially having feathers would have helped keep this animal's body temperature stable. Uh, when we're talking about, how the evolution of feathers, these early feathers that we're talking about, um, would not have been like the very complex feathers that you think of when you think of a feather today. A modern flight feather of a bird is a very complex structure with a central shaft, and it's got branches coming off of that central shaft, and each of those branches has smaller branches coming off of that, and each of those branches has even smaller, hooks coming off of that, and all those hooks hook together and zip together into a single structure. So it's quite complex. But the earliest feathers, that we know of, probably would not have looked like that. They probably would have been much simpler. So they might have been more like hair-like tufts, like single filaments, or a lot of filaments joined together at the base, something like that. So these wouldn't have been flight feathers at all. These probably would have primarily been used for the animals to keep themselves warm. So primarily for insulation. That's something that could have been present in early dinosaurs, but we're not entirely sure. It is possible that different groups of dinosaurs evolved filamentous body coverings independently, because we do also know of dinosaurs that don't seem to have had many or even any filaments at all. And so, what's going on there? Did they lose the filaments, or was it because that filaments evolved several times in dinosaurs? It is a subject of ongoing debate, so we're not sure. Now, as you probably know if you're a dinosaur buff, dinosaurs traditionally are considered to split into two main lineages. One of these are the ornithischians, or bird-hipped dinosaurs, which do not include birds, confusingly. The ornithischians include a wide variety of plant-eating groups, like the duck-billed dinosaurs and the armored dinosaurs and the horned dinosaurs. And then the other major group of dinosaurs are the saurischians, or lizard-hipped dinosaurs, which, again, counterintuitively are actually the group that includes birds. And the saurischians include the giant long-necked sauropod dinosaurs and also the meat-eating theropod dinosaurs. Now, again, if you are a dinosaur buff, you probably know this. In recent years, there has been some controversy about whether or not this traditional classification is correct, because a study published in 2017 proposed, based on a large analysis, that the ornithischian dinosaurs are actually more closely related to the theropod dinosaurs than the sauropod dinosaurs are. So, it might be that this classification will need a rethinking. But nonetheless, this is a controversial subject, and a lot of paleontologists still think that the traditional Saurischian ornithischian divide is the better supported hypothesis at present. So for now, I base my diagram on that. But nonetheless, be aware that this is an subject of ongoing controversy. It's not going to be that relevant for understanding bird origins, but it is a thing that's happening. Now, one of the features that have suggested to us that the sauropods and theropods are close relatives is that both of them have hollow air spaces in their vertebrae. And birds, as you probably know, have hollow bones. And when we say they have hollow bones, what we mean is that their bones have large cavities filled with air in them. Now, because all of our bones have a cavity inside that's filled with bone marrow. At least many of our bones do. But in birds, most of their bones are not filled with marrow, but with air spaces. And what these air spaces are, you might think, well, of course, birds have hollow bones because they need to be lighter so they can fly. But in fact, kind of hollow bones, at least the hollow vertebrae, are a common feature of all Saurischian dinosaurs. And so why might this, what might this have been good for? Well, of course, lightening the body can be quite useful even if you can't fly. But probably the main reason those air spaces are there is that they are room for air sacs. Now, birds have a very complex breathing system where they have these air sacs that come off of their lungs. And these air sacs, well, I guess before we go there, in our lungs, what happens is that we breathe in and our lungs inflate, and when we breathe out, our lungs deflate, right? And then the air comes in and goes back out, or the air goes back out the same way that it came in, like retracing its steps, kind of. But in a bird, the breathing system works pretty differently. So in a bird, the lungs are actually quite static. They don't inflate and deflate um, like ours do. What happens is that when a bird breathes in, some of the fresh air goes into its lungs, but some of it goes into the air sacs that are surrounding the lungs. And the air sacs themselves are not really doing any oxygen exchange or anything like that. They're kind of just holding the air there. And the air sacs are also acting as the bellows that are pumping the air through the lungs. So the air sacs inflate and deflate as the bird breathes in and out, and that movement pushes the air through the lungs. When a bird breathes out, now the stale air in its lungs gets pushed out, through its nose, but some of the fresh air that was being kept in the air sacs in while it was breathing in get pushed into the lungs. So when a bird breathes out, it still gets fresh air coming into the lungs because there was fresh air in the air sacs from the previous, inhalation. So a bird's breathing system is a very complex affair where a bird can get, fresh oxygen whether it is breathing in or out, and it's all kind of, powered by these air sacs. And these air sacs are so large that we say that they invade the bone. So they actually extend through holes in the bone and go and inside the bones themselves. And so that is why birds have hollow bones, is because they make space for these air sacs. And so it seems to be the case that in saurischians, we start seeing the air sacs invading the vertebrae. And as you know, in both sauropods and theropods, we see in trends where the air sacs start invading more and more of the bones in the body. In modern birds, almost every bone in the body can be invaded by air sacs, which is pretty remarkable. So birds are basically like balloon animals, kind of. Um, Now, the air sacs might have already been present earlier in bird evolution, so in early dinosaurs, but air sacs invading the vertebrae, where the vertebrae themselves have air spaces in them, seems to be a feature of saurischian dinosaurs, if Saurischia is a real thing. Yeah, anything to add there?
Not particularly.
Okay, so let's keep going up this tree. Now, birds are not sauropod dinosaurs. They belong to the meat-eating theropod dinosaurs. Now, we say meat-eating because most, if not all, of the meat-eating dinosaurs we know of are theropods, and ancestrally, dinosaurs would have been carnivorous animals, but the ornithischians and sauropods decided, you know, to go and eat plants instead. But there are also some theropods that have, decided to stop eating meat. So there are a number of herbivorous theropod species, um, including some birds, of course. So there are birds that primarily eat seeds, or a few that eat leaves or grasses, things like that. So even though we popularly call the theropods the meat-eating dinosaurs, not all theropods were or are carnivores. Now, the theropods share a number of different features. I've only given a few as examples here. So one of them is the wishbone. This two-pronged bone, which is formed by the fusion of the two clavicles, so the two collarbones, you have collarbones too, fused together. And in a modern bird, the wishbones kind of serve as a brace for when the wings are flapping. But the earliest theropods could not fly, so what were they using this wishbone for? Maybe it would have helped them withstand stresses of struggling prey when they were using their hands to grab onto prey, because the earliest theropods, were meat eaters, and they had these sharp claws on their hands that might have been helpful for attacking their prey items. So potentially the wishbone originally served in this function, and we have wishbones even from very, very early theropods preserved in the fossil record. Theropods also have a reduced innermost toe. So they don't have the outermost toe that we have, so they don't have the little toe. Theropods have four-toed feet, but the innermost toe, so the equivalent of our big toe, is much smaller than the others, and in most theropods it does not touch the ground at all, so they're walking on three-toed feet. Um, in modern birds, the innermost toe has become, um, has in many cases started to touch the ground instead, although it is still shorter than the others, and we will see a bit further up the tree what they do with this innermost toe. I'm skipping a few nodes on this diagram. So there are a number of different groups of theropods, but one particular group that is worthy of mention in this context is Coelurosaurs. Um, the Coelurosaurs include a very broad range of theropods, not only birds but also tyrannosaurs and dromaeosaurids, the so-called raptor dinosaurs, and Coelurosaurs ancestrally were pretty small carnivores and with very slender limbs, so they were probably pretty agile hunters, hunting for small animals in the shadow of much larger theropods. Of course, eventually some of them did evolve giant sizes. Eventually, one of them became one of, if not the largest theropods that we know of, Tyrannosaurus rex. So not all of them stayed small, but nonetheless, birds have kind of gone the opposite direction where they became smaller and smaller from this already small ancestral body plan. And Coelurosaurs are the group where we can be pretty sure that feathers were very, very widespread in this group. Um, so pretty much almost every time we find fossil evidence of the skin of a Coelurosaur, it's covered in feathers. So we're pretty sure feathers were widespread here. It's possible some of the larger tyrannosaurs or some of the biggest Coelurosaurs um, lost most of their feathers because we have fossil evidence of kind of scaly skin covering tyrannosaurs. But for most part, it seems that Coelurosaurs were feathered dinosaurs. And one group of Coelurosaurs are the Penoraptorans. Penoraptorans include birds and the dromaeosaurids, like the raptor dinosaurs, and also a group called the oviraptorosaurs. And these dinosaurs, we have fossil evidence that they not only had feathers, but also they had complex feathers. So they had feathers with a central shaft and branches coming off of that central shaft, at least, if not branches coming off of those. And their feathers are arranged in the way along their arms and their hands that they form a planar structure, so they basically have wings. But nonetheless, it doesn't seem like the earliest Pelaraptorans were flight capable, so these wings probably served other functions. So potentially they could have served as surfaces for display. They might have had, fancy patterns or colors on them. They might have been used to help cover their nests because we have fossil evidence of some of the oviraptorosaurs, sitting on top of their nests and kind of spreading their wings over their eggs. So it's possible that the wings would have been helpful for protecting their nests. Another feature related to the hand in Penoraptorans is that they have what we call a half moon shaped wrist bone, and what this does is that it allows the hand to fold towards the forearm. Now, if you want to mimic a dinosaur, a lot of people will go around holding their palms facing downward in kind of a kind of zombie-like posture, and this wasn't possible in most dinosaurs. Instead, they would have held their hands kind of permanently facing, with the palms facing each other, like kind of like clapping, applauding. And you can actually try this if you ever have the chance to work with a chicken wing. If you try to twist the bony end of the chicken wing, which is actually its hand, to face the palm downward, it's going to break right off. So, that's not a very healthy thing for a dinosaur to have been able to do. But what they can do, what Penoraptorans can do, is that they can fold the kind of the pinky side, even though they don't have a pinky finger, they only have three fingers. They can hold the pinky side of the hand towards their forearm. So in doing so, they kind of keep the large feathers on their hands clear of the ground, clear of obstructions. So that would have been a helpful thing to have when they have complex feathers on their forelimbs. And among the Pinoraptorans, there is a group called Paraves. This is a group that unites Velociraptor and modern birds, and also a group called the Troodontids. And these dinosaurs have a relatively large brain, so potentially, they might have been relatively smart. Now, early, Mesozoic Paravians like Velociraptor and Troodontids did not have brains relatively as large as the what we would consider the most intelligent birds today, things like corvids and parrots, but they would have been larger than most other Mesozoic dinosaurs. So that is a notable feature of this group. Their hands also become even longer, and so probably they could have larger wings. And it is also in Paravians that we start seeing dinosaurs that are potentially capable of flight, or at least some kind of aerial locomotion. Now, it's not clear if ancestrally flight was present in Paravians. The current evidence, there have been several recent papers about this, seems to suggest that flight evolved several times in Paravians. However, this it is in this group that we start seeing the kind of beginnings of flight capable forms. Now, there's a group within Paraves called Aviale, and this is the group that most people will be referring to when they talk about Mesozoic birds, so things like Archaeopteryx and the opposite birds and Confuciusornis, Ichthyornis, all those guys, as well as modern birds, are members of Aviale. Now, the earliest members of Aviale wouldn't have been that different from other Paravians. Something like Archaeopteryx is really not that much more bird-like than a raptor dinosaur or a troodontid. So this category has kind of received a lot of attention because historically Archaeopteryx was one of the earliest fossil Paravians to be ever, Mesozoic Paravians to be ever discovered, but we don't really see a big jump in birdiness at this point. Not really. There are a few kind of birdie traits here. So the snout becomes relatively shorter. Birds have what we say are babyfied. Okay, that's not a technical term, but they have babyfied faces compared to, the technical term would be pedomorphic faces compared to other dinosaurs. So the snout becomes relatively shorter and the brain becomes relatively larger. So we do see a little bit of increase in that here in Aviale, and the base of the tail becomes more slender. The tail in birds receives a lot less emphasis than other dinosaurs, and as we shall see in the group Pygostylia among Aviale, the tail becomes very, very short, and the vertebrae at the end of the tail are fused into a structure called a pygostyle, and that's what we see in a modern bird tail. Then we get to a group called Ornithothoraces, a long name. I didn't name these names, so don't look at me. This group we see the shoulder socket, the shoulder socket becomes oriented in a way that allows the arms to be raised high up above the back. So the members of Ornithothoraces have been capable of a very large flight stroke, and they also start fusing a lot of their bones in the hand, and their fingers become a lot shorter, their claws on their hands become a lot smaller. So it seems like this was a group where definitely powered flight was taking place, or at least, more sophisticated powered flight was possible. And so we start seeing these dinosaurs that probably weren't primarily using the hand for any kind of grasping function, much if at all. So they were primarily using the forelimbs for flight. And they also have the innermost toe. Remember, all theropods have a small innermost toe, or most of them do, a small innermost toe. It becomes kind of rotated around to the back of the foot, and so it points backwards in Ornithothoraces. And what this does is it allows the foot to grab stuff more easily. And so a bird, it doesn't have grasping hands, but it can land on a branch and grab onto the branch with its feet. And that's where we see this feature kind of achieve the condition we see in modern birds. Within Ornithothoraces, there's a group called Euornithes, and Euornithes are characterized by having what we call a mobile tail fan. So in a modern bird, even though the tail is very short, they often have these large feathers coming off of the tail, and there are these muscles in the tail that allow the tail feathers to spread apart like a fan, and that's quite important for birds when they want to land. It helps them slow down, and it also helps them have better control of their direction in flight, their maneuverability. And when we find fossils of the feathers preserved, it is only in Euornithes where we see evidence of this mobile tail fan. So the other other feathered dinosaurs might have had large feathers coming off the tail, but they don't seem to have been able to kind of spread them in this fan-like manner to assist with flight. And Euornithes also tend to have toothless jaw tips, so the very, very tip of the jaw has a toothless section in it, but ancestrally they would have had teeth in the rest of the jaw as well. And finally, Neornithes is a group within Euornithes, and they are characterized by, among other things that I mentioned earlier, complete loss of the teeth. So that's kind of a brief, yes, that qualifies as brief, overview of the evolution of bird-like traits. So
It's
then let's.
important to note that
Mhm.
all of these different groups that Albert has just mentioned, these are known as clades,
Right.
groups of organisms that share a common ancestor. For those of you who might be wondering where our uh, title for our show comes from.
Mm. Right. Yes, that's right. Through time and clades, yeah, because we are, interested in a broad, spectrum of living things through time and through different clades. That's correct. Yeah. So on the next slide, I have a basic phylogenetic tree of Neornithes. So these are the main groups that Neornithes splits into. Um, so we've worked up our way up the dinosaur family tree to Neornithes, and these are how to divide. This is how to divide the Neornithes even further. So the Neornithes split into two main groups. One are the Paleonates, which includes a lot of the big flightless birds like ostriches and cassowaries pictured here, emus, those guys, um, and the Neonates, which are all the other birds pretty much. Neonates in turn split into Galloancerae, the chicken-like and duck-like birds, and Neoaves, which is everyone else. And Neoaves includes 95% of all living birds. So in the you know episodes coming up in the series, we'll be talking about all of these groups in more detail. But this is the basic structure of the tree that um, uh, you should know for now. uh, so, um, you know, we know about how kind of modern birds acquired their these birdie features that make them so distinctive in modern day. But there are still a lot of aspects of their evolution that are very, very controversial. And one of them is, when did they appear? So we know they evolved from other dinosaurs at some point in the Mesozoic. But when in the Mesozoic modern type birds or crown birds appeared, I said I would try not to use modern birds. Um, when they appeared is a subject of very intense controversy. Now, what can we tell from the fossil record? The oldest uh, fossil that is pretty much, uncontroversially, definitely a crown bird is this fossil that I pictured here called Asteriornis. Full disclosure, I helped name this fossil earlier this year. It was a really fun project to work on, incredibly exciting. But yes, all this is the oldest known crown bird fossil that everyone agrees is a crown bird. There's another one called Vegavis, which is just slightly younger. It's about 66.5 million years old. So all of our oldest crown bird fossils come from around 66-ish million years ago, and that would have been at the very, very, very end of the Cretaceous period. So uh, right before the great mass extinction, which happened 66 million years ago, more or less on the dot. I I couldn't tell you what day of the week it was, but we have a pretty refined date for that event. Now, the fossil record, as we know, can be pretty incomplete. So if you find the oldest known fossil of a group, that is almost certainly not the oldest member of that group ever to have existed. Um, but the question is, how much older was this group? Now, Fortunately, we do have a method with which we can get a sense of how old at least living groups are, and this is called the molecular clock. Are you familiar with this method?
Certainly, yeah. I've seen it applied to many different groups over the years, and
Mm-hmm.
I understand its use varies depending on what organisms you're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Yeah, so obviously it only works for groups that we have molecular sequences from, either proteins or genetics. So, either living things or very, very, very recently extinct things. But nonetheless, the general idea of a molecular clock is basically you give a computer program a bunch of genetic or protein sequences, and then based on the differences between these sequences, between different organisms, uh, the program will estimate, how long would it have taken to accumulate all these differences, and then estimate from that how old this group is, when all these groups diverged from whenever their last common ancestor was. And so this method has been applied to crown birds. But the problem is, we get quite a large spread of dates when we apply this method to crown birds. So, for example, I've listed a bunch of examples here. So you have very relatively young dates, like 72.7 million years ago, which is less than 10 million years before the oldest known crown bird fossils. But then you have increasingly older dates. So most of the recent dates, most of the dates that were done after 2014 or so, find dates of 100 million years or younger, so sometime in the late Cretaceous. But if you go back to the 2000s, there were some dates that were really, really old, so putting them in the early Cretaceous, or in one case, even in the Jurassic. Now, the study that found this result explicitly said, we don't really believe this. We think this is probably an error in our analysis, so don't read too much into that. But
Oh yeah,
nonetheless,
that would mean that crown birds are older than Archaeopteryx.
right, yes. Yes, our Archaeopteryx is from the late Jurassic, about, 150-ish million, something like that. So it's kind of ridiculous that they would have never left a fossil record within that time frame if they were around. So, but nonetheless, this kind of gives us a sense of what a range of dates we have when we try to apply this method to crown birds. So, why might this be? Now, there are some factors that influence molecular clock estimates. So, the thing is, molecular clock estimates are not actually, in most cases, they're not usually completely independent of fossil evidence. Because what you need to do, well, first of all, we know that kind of rates of genetic evolution can change over time. So you shouldn't try to assume, in most cases, you shouldn't assume a strict kind of clock, like a strict clock. We call it a strict clock. You shouldn't assume that the rates of genetic evolution are consistent throughout time. And so if you assume a strict clock, you might get kind of incorrect or misleading results. And so what we usually do is that uh, we will take the fossil record into account, and then use fossils as what we call calibrations to calibrate the molecular clock. So you tell the computer program we're using that this is the oldest known fossil of this particular group that we're interested in. So this group has to be at least this old. And then you try to, if ideally at least, you try to calibrate as many of these groups that you're including as possible using this method. And then from there, hopefully you can better constrain a more plausible date using the molecular clock. However, if a fossil is misidentified, for example, and doesn't actually belong to a certain group you're assigning it to, but you use it as a calibration for your molecular clock, that can, produce incorrect results, as you might be able to imagine, right? Um, Also, some people have tried to use other types of calibrations other than fossils for molecular clocks. So people have speculated about, oh, what if certain groups diverge from each other at the at the age of the splitting of different land masses, for example. And then we can use the splitting of the land masses to calibrate the molecular clock. So in a kind of well-known example would be in passerine birds, perching birds. Perching birds are 60% of all living birds, and they include things like finches and sparrows, swallows, crows, warblers. All these small kind of perchy and singy birds are all passerines. The modern passerines split into two major groups, and one of these groups is called the acanthocytids, or New Zealand wrens, even though they're not true wrens, and the other lineage leads to all the other living passerines. And now New Zealand wrens are only found in New Zealand, so people have thought, maybe we can use the date that New Zealand split from all the other continents, and then we could calibrate the age of when New Zealand wrens split from all the other passerines. Seems like a good idea, right? But well, the New Zealand split from all the other continents in the Cretaceous period, and we have absolutely no fossil evidence that any passerine or any of the groups closely related to passerines were found during the Cretaceous. And obviously, that by itself, because the fossil record has gaps, that by itself might not constitute really strong evidence, but it makes you think. And furthermore, birds can fly, right? Now, New Zealand wrens. Right. New Zealand wrens are not particularly good flyers, but that doesn't mean that was always the case. Their ancestors could well have been, perfectly fine flyers. We can't really assume that they split from all the other passerines when New Zealand split apart, because it's possible that their ancestors flew to New Zealand. so,
Yeah, that would be like trying to find out the origin of bats.
right.
Saying that you run into a lot of problems.
Exactly. Right. So, in fact, more recent estimates that do not assume that this first split between modern passerines happened in the Cretaceous tend to find much more recent dates for the timing of this event. So, if you assume if you assume a certain group is already a certain age, that can give you a misleading result. And of course, there are the changes in rates of molecular evolution in themselves. Now, we do have a lot of models to try and take these into account. So we have a pretty good sense of how genetic sequences evolve and how fast they can evolve. And so on. So a lot of the time when we run these analyses, we will try to take into account changes in rates of molecular evolution and allow the analysis to take into consider these possibilities. But in the case of crowned birds, we do have reason to think that, in some cases at least, we are overestimating their age. And this was one of the reasons for this was this study done by Jake Berv and by my supervisor, Daniel Field. They published this in 2018. What they found was that they estimated the ancestral size of crowned birds based on living birds, but also based on the close relatives of living birds that are found in the fossil record. So things like ichthyornis-like birds and opposite birds. So they looked at those groups that were found at the very end of the Cretaceous and compared them to kind of modern birds to try and estimate the ancestral body size of crowned birds. And what they found was that it seems like the ancestral body size of crowned birds was probably quite small, smaller than their close fossil relatives. Now, body size correlates with pretty much everything about your biology. Everything. Like the rates of reproduction, rates of genetic evolution, lifespan, metabolism. Body size is not the end all and be all, but it is strongly correlated with pretty much everything in biology. And so, if birds went through this, ancestral stage in which they were particularly small-bodied, that might mean that they had particularly fast rates of molecular evolution during this time. But if we don't take this into account, the analysis might think that it takes longer than it actually did for all of these changes to happen because they're happening at a faster rate. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So what the authors of this paper did um, was that they took modern birds and they basically for every major group of modern birds they tried to estimate um, they did a molecular clock analysis for basically if you only include small bodied birds, or if you only included medium sized birds, or if you only included big birds in the analysis, and see how that changes the age. And what they found was that if you only include small birds, it finds an older age for this group. So it is possible that because modern birds went through this, small bodied phase, a lot of our estimates are making them seem older than they actually were. It definitely seems plausible. What do you think?
I'd believe it. I mean, it seems like most organismal groups tend to start out small anyway.
True. Yeah. And in fact, they suggested that this kind of small-bodied phase correlates with the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction, and so obviously that was an event that would have favored the survival of small-bodied organisms. So what's kind of the takeaway from this? Well, we do have fossil evidence, uh, and that there were crown birds in the late Cretaceous, and recent molecular clock estimates since about 2014 or so all tend to agree that they originated sometime in the late Cretaceous. So that much is consistent. And so from this we can estimate that at least three crown bird lineages survived the end Cretaceous mass extinction, and those were the three groups that I showed you earlier. So the Paleonates, the Gallo-Anserans, and the Neo-Avians, or at least the ancestors of all these three lineages had split by this time and had survived the what we call the KPG, Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction. Now, a particularly controversial aspect of crown bird origins is the origin of the group Neo-Aves, that group that includes 95% of all living birds, because there is no strong fossil evidence for any modern type Neo-Avian in the Cretaceous, pretty much. Now there are some fossils that people have suggested are Neo-Avians from the
Oh yeah,
Cretaceous.
and I definitely remember growing up with some books where they would illustrate these birds alongside non-avian dinosaurs. Things like
Absolutely, yeah.
flamingos and shorebirds and
Yep.
uh, parrots and so forth.
Right, right, yeah. There are fossils that people have suggested are belong to this group. But the problem is, pretty much all of these fossils are, very, very fragmentary. They are like a piece of the shoulder or like a tip of a beak or things like that. And, we do know convergent evolution is pretty rampant in birds. So having just such a small part of the skeleton to work from, I don't think we can very confidently refer any of these fossils to Neo-Aves. And in fact, some of them do have features that suggest that they could be, other types of birds or non-Neo-Avian birds. Um, so I don't really think we can definitively say at all that there were any crown Neo-Avians in the Cretaceous. Now, something interesting about Neo-Aves is no matter what date you believe that they appeared at, the genetic evidence that there was a very, very, very fast radiation of Neo-Avians is very strong. So you can see this in this diagram I have on this slide. So Neo-Aves is here, and you can see how closely packed together all these branches are, and that's because there was probably a very, very fast diversification event happening at the base of Neo-Aves. So, you know, um, evolution can happen really, really fast under certain circumstances. I mean, the way evolution is taught is that we often say, oh, it takes a really long time for evolution to happen. But we actually know it can happen at a very rapid pace sometimes as well. And in fact, we have actually observed right now in present day uh, examples of very fast evolution. So I know a well-known example, I think, is of these lizards that were transported to an island. And what happened was within a span of decades, it was like 3 or 4 decades, these lizards had evolved specializations for eating plant material on this island where there were formerly not any plant eating lizards. which is quite remarkable, isn't it? Are you familiar with this particular case?
I believe so. Do you remember what island it was?
It was, I think, somewhere in the Mediterranean. I might be wrong, but yeah,
That sounds about right.
yeah,
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 like they like adapted parts of the jaw to
right,
handle certain
yeah.
plants. I remember
That
that.
that's right. Yeah, yeah, and even parts of their digestive system too. Um, so so evolution can actually happen very fast under certain circumstances, especially if there is, kind of the open ecological niches available. And what would have been a time when there would have been a lot of open niches available, around the late Cretaceous? Well, that would have been the aftermath of the KPG mass extinction.
Oh,
So
obviously.
I think it is very plausible that the modern neo-aves, the crown group of neo-aves, originated in the aftermath of the Cretaceous mass extinction. Or at least most of the major groups did, even if there were, two or three that were already around beforehand. I strongly suspect that the most of them originate in the aftermath and not beforehand. And
Oh yeah,
again,
I recognize that placental mammals, or
mhm,
probably mammals and like crown mammals in general,
mhm,
probably went through the same thing,
right.
this adaptive radiation.
Right, right. Yeah, there's a very, very similar controversy going on in terms of timing the origin of placental mammals, and I think something very similar is going on. So as I mentioned previously, we do have reason to think that we might be overestimating some of these crown bird ages, right? So in this particular study that I took this figure from, they estimated neo-aves at about 69 million years old, so just slightly before the KPG. So if we're slightly overestimating, isn't it plausible that you could just shift that over just by a little bit, especially when all of these diversification events happen so close to each other? So, in fact, most of the recent molecular studies do find the origin of aves to be around this date. So I do think it is possible that crown neo-aves originated after the KPG, or at least, most of this diversification had not happened before then.
I'm very
Now,
curious.
yeah, yeah,
Since it's possible to calibrate a molecular clock
mm,
study
yeah,
to things like continental drift,
yeah.
has anybody ever tried to calibrate it to like the dates of mass extinction events?
You know what? Um, Not strictly like I can think of. Like we might use mass extinction events as what we call a soft calibration. So, well, we might say that, oh, because this mass extinction happened at this time, um, it is not likely that this group was around before then. But most of the time, I haven't seen it used as kind of a hard calibration. So, telling the analysis it must be, must be around this time or things like that. Um,
Right. Okay.
yeah, but I do know of people working on this where they want to take into account effects of mass extinction. So where they want to be able to incorporate into analyses like, hey, there's a mass extinction here. It is more likely for organisms to evolve more quickly in the wake of a mass extinction. So how about you try and take that into account? I do know people working on that, and I do think that is likely to be an important advance when it comes to trying to understand the age of crown birds and mammals too. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. Now, anyway, so that's my take at least on this subject. There are paleontologists who would disagree with me. There are paleontologists who say that, oh, look, we have these all these penguin fossils at around 62 million years ago. That is only 4 million years after the great mass extinction. So we think that penguins most likely were around in the Cretaceous already. So they could have had time to diversify to that point. But it I won't say that it is impossible, but because we have this evidence that evolution can happen super quickly when there's the opportunity to do so. We have this evidence that we might be overestimating crown bird ages, and we have this evidence that there was a major event that happened at a certain time that would have been favorable to rapid diversification. Um, and we have evidence that there was a rapid diversification at the base of neo-aves. So I currently at least favor a kind of post-Cretaceous, primarily post-Cretaceous radiation for neoaves. And if we look at the tree here, for example, if there were penguins in the Cretaceous, so if the penguin lineage was already around in the Cretaceous, there would have had to be at least one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight other neo-avian lineages, based on this particular tree at least, eight other neo-avian lineages that were also around in the Cretaceous, because those divergence events would have had to have happened at that time. Eight lineages, nine plus the penguins, that were around at this time, but have left no fossil record whatsoever. And these were animals that can fly, that could, fly around the world and potentially leave fossils anywhere. Now, granted, bird fossils are pretty hard to preserve, but we do find, fossils of very bird-like groups at the end of the Cretaceous, and so far, again, we have found no convincing evidence of any kind of crowned neo-avian in the late Cretaceous.
I feel like it would go even deeper than that, because
Uh-huh.
like if they want to argue that a lot of these neo-avian groups were around before the extinction
Mm,
event, but we seem confident that this diversification went on,
right.
and what would have caused that rapid speciation in the first place? They would have
Yeah.
to
I
take into account like environmental factors and stuff.
Right, I tend to agree. Yeah, like I think the KPG is the most obvious candidate for what could have caused such a rapid diversification event. So yeah, that again, my take. There are people who disagree, and you will find other takes on this in the literature, or if you talk to other bird paleontologists. But I think that's where I currently stand right now. What do you think?
I think it's pretty solid.
Oh, well, I'm glad you think so. All right. Let's see. We don't have too much left to cover, I believe. So, one of the major questions regarding the crown bird origins, in addition to when they originated, is how did they survive the KPG? None of the other dinosaurs did. So why only crown birds? Um, well, it is possible, they were lucky. It is very, very hard to test this possibility. It's very hard to discount the possibility that they just happened to be lucky and there just happened to be a few crown birds survived when no other dinosaurs did. It's definitely possible. But we do have reason to think that crown birds have certain features that would have benefited them in this disaster. First of all, they were pretty small. Of course, they were much smaller than most of the other dinosaurs, which means that they would have needed less food. And of course, one of the main reasons probably that was driving the extinction of so many species during the KPG was that during that gigantic asteroid impact, a lot of debris would have been flung into the atmosphere and blocked out the sunlight, which of course would have killed off a lot of plants, in turn killing off a lot of animals, in turn killing off a lot of animals that ate those other animals. And so, food was in scarce supply. So if you were a small animal, you were more likely to have been able to survive this event because you would have needed less food. Even though birds have pretty high metabolisms in terms of their absolute food requirements, they probably wouldn't have needed to eat as much as, a T-Rex did. Also, of course, birds can fly, so they can potentially have an easier time finding food than other animals because they could just, if they can't find food in one area, they could try and fly off somewhere else and find food there. So that could have been helpful. Now, some people have suggested that crown birds originated in the southern hemisphere specifically, and this is partly based on the distribution of modern bird groups. Like if you take the distribution of modern birds and try to estimate where their last common ancestor lived, you will find the analysis will tell you, oh, most likely it was the southern hemisphere. So people have suggested that they originated there, and the idea behind this kind of refuge idea is that the asteroid impact struck in the northern hemisphere. It struck somewhere in what is now today the Gulf of Mexico, which would have been in the northern hemisphere during that time. And so maybe by living in the southern hemisphere, the ancestors of modern birds evolved, or rather, the ancestors of modern birds avoided the worst effects of the extinction. It is possible, but as we shall see, there are some wrinkles to this tale. But I think it's not just about why the crown birds survived when the large dinosaurs didn't, but also why didn't any of the other very bird-like dinosaurs survive? So things like the opposite birds, the Enantiornithians. So this was another group of the group. I'm using group a lot. Another group within the clade Ornithotheraces, the group with more sophisticated flapping flight, that was very diverse and common during the Cretaceous. In fact, fossils of opposite birds are much more common than fossils of crown birds in the Cretaceous. So why didn't the opposite birds survived when they were so much similar to when they were so similar to crown birds? Well, we do know that they differed from crown birds in a few ways. So first of all, they grew a lot more slowly than crown birds. Crown birds have some of the fastest growth rates of any kind of vertebrate group. So most crown birds grow to adulthood in much less than a year, sometimes in a matter of weeks even. Whereas we know that the opposite birds took several years to grow to adulthood, even though a lot of them were very small birds, like the size of a sparrow or a thrush or something like that. They took several years to grow to adulthood, which is the kind of growth strategy that most dinosaurs used. And so, well, how is this relevant? Well, um, it seems that because they took several years to grow to adulthood, a lot of dinosaurs, potentially including opposite birds, took on several different ecological niches during their growth. So as they grew bigger and bigger, they would start eating different things or doing different things as they grew. Whereas modern birds pretty much have basically two growth stages. They have a baby and then boom, they quickly become an adult. So uh, if you have basically just these two growth stages, you only have what we call 2 points of failure. So as long as there are conditions that can allow both your baby and your adult form to survive, you have a chance at surviving. But if you have multiple growth stages that are all doing different things, and the resources that one of those growth stages depends on is destroyed, or goes away, disappears, whatever, then you're in trouble, right? Um, Another feature is that the fact that crown birds are completely toothless. Now, as far as we know, very few opposite birds were toothless. Most of them had teeth, at least the ones that we have skull material do. And it has been suggested that having a toothless beak helped modern birds uh, become better specialized for cracking open seeds to eat. And seeds would have potentially been a useful food source during the KPG extinction event, because even though a lot of the leafy green foliage would have died out from the lack of sunlight, plant seeds can remain dormant in the ground for a very long time. So they would have potentially been still a very available and very nutritious food source for any animal that would have been able to crack them open and eat them. So it has been suggested that this was relevant to the survival of crown birds, which is possible. And in another study done by my supervisor and his colleagues, they suggested a third possibility, and that is that ancestrally modern birds seem to have been ground dwelling animals. And of course, there are many birds today that live in trees. You just have to walk outside and look around, and you'll see plenty of tree dwelling birds today. But if you estimate what the lifestyle of the ancestral crown bird was, it was most likely a ground dwelling animal. And that doesn't mean it wasn't flight capable. It was a flying bird, almost certainly, but it probably would have spent a lot of time walking around on the ground looking for food on the ground. It probably wasn't dependent on trees for survival. And something about trees is that there is evidence that there was deforestation during the Cretaceous mass extinction event. There were probably big global forest fires that would have destroyed a lot of the forests. And from what we can tell from their anatomy, most opposite birds seem to have been tree dwelling animals. They had feet that were well adapted to grasping onto tree branches. They probably spent a lot of time in trees. And so it is possible that because of this deforestation, the opposite birds lost the trees and forests that they depended on, whereas the crown birds were still able to survive because they were mostly living on the ground. Do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I definitely think that if you consider like the birds in your area,
Mm-hmm.
many of them do live in the trees,
Mm-hmm.
but if you look hard enough, you'll find a lot of the ground adapting ones too.
Right,
Especially if you
absolutely.
live out like in the Western United States, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe the English countryside.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Um, So what they proposed was that the after the forest returned following the Cretaceous mass extinction, that's when crown birds started evolving into tree-dwelling niches, and then we get this big diversity of tree-dwelling birds again. But this time it was the crown birds and not the opposite birds that were occupying those niches. So let's see what's left. Okay, right. So earlier this year, I helped describe a new type of fossil bird. It is currently the oldest known crown bird fossil, and we decided to name it Asteriornis. So we think it was an early member of the total group, the pan group of Galloanserae, so the group that includes both chickens and ducks. And this is based on a lot of the features we see in its skull. We have a very, very well preserved, nearly complete skull to look at, as well as some bits and pieces of other parts of its skeleton. And we decided to name it Asteriornis after the Greek goddess Asteria, who is the goddess of falling stars, in reference to the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction, the asteroid impact. And
Yeah, that's a perfect name.
yeah, we really like it. That was the idea of our co-author Dan Sepka, who is a one of the top experts in fossil birds today. And furthermore, in Greek mythology, Asteria turned into a quail to try and avoid Zeus, who was being his usual, Zeus self and
Hmm.
very amorous, as they say. So she turned into a quail and jumped into the sea to try and escape from him. And of course, since Asteriornis was a close relative of this chicken and duck group, which also includes quails, that is also an appropriate name. Furthermore, Asteriornis, the fossil of Asteriornis that we have, was preserved in marine rocks, the rocks that formed in the sea. So it was probably living on the shoreline while it was alive, and its body got washed into the ocean. So the name Asteriornis is very, very fulfilling in three ways. Um, so what can Asteriornis tell us about crown birds at the very end of the Cretaceous? Well, it was small. It was much smaller than your average domestic chicken or domestic duck. It was about the size of a common quail, so quite small. Um, and what we have a few bones from its hind limbs, and these bones are quite long and slender. So this suggests that it was probably looking for food on the ground, on the shoreline. Probably wasn't hanging out much in the trees. And the shape of its beak was pretty generalized. Like it's not obviously adapted for going after any specific type of food. So we suspect that it would probably have a pretty generalist diet. It could, eat a little bit of everything if it wanted to. So remember, all of these features were features we predicted. Remember, Asteriornis was only named earlier this year, and so a lot of these predictions were made before, sometimes long before we knew Asteriornis existed. So we predicted that crown birds at the end of the Cretaceous would be small, ground dwelling, and probably capable of eating a variety of foods, including seeds. And all of these predictions are consistent with the anatomy of Asteriornis. Isn't that cool?
Oh, I love when that happens.
Yeah. And now, granted, this is one fossil, so it is quite possible that we'll find other fossils that are not consistent with this pattern. But nonetheless, the fact that it is, you know, the fact that it does fulfill these predictions is quite thrilling and potentially relevant to our discussions about what end-Cretaceous crown birds were like. Now, something interesting about Asteriornis is that it is not from the southern hemisphere. It was found in Belgium. It was found very close to the border between the Belgium and the Netherlands. So it was a European bird that lived at the end of the Cretaceous, whereas as been suggested, previously that crown birds originate in the southern hemisphere, and that other crown bird fossil I mentioned, Vegavis, was found in Antarctica. So that seemed to be consistent with this idea. But with Asteriornis, we can say that crown birds were already living in both the northern and southern hemispheres during the end of the Cretaceous. Now, of course, it is still possible that it was the crown birds in the southern hemisphere that survived, and Asteriornis was kind of a dead end kind of deal. But even so, it does mean that we can't really confidently say where in the world the last common ancestor of crown birds lived. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add?
Not particularly.
Okay. Let's see. I believe that you're right. The next slide is going to be a preview for the next episode of Dinosaurs, the second chapter. Now, that is not going to be the next episode of Through Time and Clades that we release, because the next one is going to be when Joan starts her series on human evolution. Is that right?
That's right.
Yep. So it'll be 2 or 3 episodes after this one will be the next Dinosaurs the Second Chapter episode. But when we get there, we are going to start taking a deep dive into crown bird diversity, and of course we are going to start with one of the two main groups that I mentioned earlier. We're going to start looking at the paleonates, the group that includes a lot of the big flightless birds like the ostriches, cassowaries, moa, which I pictured here, and kiwi. And surprisingly, how they achieved this very similar body plan again and again and again. So you have that to look forward to. Let's see, what else do I have? Right, acknowledgements. Yeah, as usual, our music was composed by our friend Henry. Thanks, Henry. And the color scheme for my avatar was created by my friend Alicia. And special thanks to Scott Hartman for letting me use his skeletal reconstructions in that slide where I was talking about the acquisition of bird features among dinosaurs. So thanks a lot for that. Uh, and I believe that's it. Hopefully everybody enjoyed that. Follow us on Twitter and on YouTube if you haven't already, and if you liked our show. If you have questions about anything, feel free to send us an email, and I will include a list of the references for this episode, which I decided to put in a Google Doc because there were so many of them, in the description for this video. So, yeah, hope you had a good one, and stay safe, everyone. Do you have anything else to add, Joan?
No, just say thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to introducing you all to human evolution next
Oh,
week.
I am really looking forward to seeing what you come up with. I think it'll be great. So yeah, do look forward to that. Keep an eye out for it, and see ya.
Bye, everybody.